September 14, 1944. Camp Breckenridge, Kentucky. Across America, prisoner of war camps housed thousands of captured enemy soldiers, most of them men who had fought on distant battlefields. But on this humid September morning, something unusual was happening at a small facility outside Louisville. A transport truck carrying 32 German women prisoners rolled through the gates, and what awaited them inside would challenge everything they believed about their American enemies. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They were members of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, captured during the Allied advance through France. Young women who had served as radio operators, clerks, and nurses for the Wehrmacht, now facing an uncertain future in enemy hands. They had been warned about American brutality, about the torture and humiliation that awaited captured Germans, but nothing had prepared them for what actually happened when they arrived. Before we discover what these women experienced in American captivity, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story begins with 23-year-old Ursula Becker, a former communications specialist from Dresden, stepping off the transport truck into the Kentucky heat. She clutched a small wooden box containing her only possessions: a photograph of her family, a Protestant prayer book, and a fountain pen her father had given her before she left for service. Around her, the other women gathered in a tight group, their gray auxiliary uniforms dusty and wrinkled from days of travel. Captain Louise Garrett, one of the few female officers assigned to oversee the facility, watched as the German women formed an instinctive defensive cluster. She had read their files and knew their backgrounds. Teachers, secretaries, nurses, ordinary young women who had believed they were serving their country's defense. Now they stood on American soil, exhausted and afraid, expecting the worst. What happened next would become the first crack in the wall of propaganda these women had been fed their entire lives. Captain Garrett stepped forward and spoke in careful, measured English that Ursula, with her decent grasp of the language, could understand. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," Garrett said. "You will be housed, fed, and given work assignments appropriate to your skills. You are prisoners, but you will be treated with dignity." The words seemed almost incomprehensible to Ursula. Dignity? For enemy prisoners? She exchanged glances with Therese Krauss, a 26-year-old nurse from Hamburg who stood beside her. Therese's face reflected the same confusion and suspicion. But it was what came next that truly shocked them. Private Raymond Cooper, a young guard from Georgia with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes, approached pushing a wheeled cart. On it sat metal pitchers sweating with condensation and stacks of tin cups. "I expect you ladies are thirsty," he said, his southern drawl thick but his meaning clear. "We've got cold lemonade here, and supper's waiting in the mess hall." Lemonade. Cold lemonade offered to enemy prisoners. Ursula felt something crack inside her chest, a tiny fissure in the certainty she had carried about who Americans were and what they represented. The mess hall at Camp Breckenridge was nothing like what the German women had imagined. Long wooden tables stretched across the room, clean and orderly, with metal trays already set at each place. The smell that greeted them as they entered made Ursula's stomach clench with unexpected emotion. It smelled like food, real food. Not the thin, watery soup they had survived on during their final weeks in France, but something substantial and warm. Sergeant Patrick Murphy, a stocky Irish-American from Boston with graying hair and laugh lines around his eyes, stood near the serving line directing the women to take seats. His manner was neither cruel nor overly friendly, simply matter of fact, as if serving dinner to enemy prisoners was the most normal thing in the world. Ursula sat between Therese and Inge Schreiber, a quiet 21-year-old from Berlin who had barely spoken since their capture. Across from them, Hildegard Stein, a former schoolteacher from Munich, watched everything with sharp, suspicious eyes. They had all been raised to expect American savagery, to believe that capture meant degradation and abuse. Yet here they sat at clean tables, being handed actual plates instead of being forced to grovel for scraps. Private Cooper appeared again. this time behind the serving counter alongside an older African-American cook whose name tag read Williams. Together they began filling plates with portions that made the women stare in disbelief. Mashed potatoes with a pool of rich brown gravy. Green beans that actually looked green, not the gray mush they remembered from the Wehrmacht mess tents. Thick slices of meatloaf that smelled of onions and herbs, and bread. Fresh bread with butter. Ursula accepted her plate with trembling hands, unable to meet Private Cooper's eyes. This had to be some kind of trick, some elaborate psychological torture designed to break them down. No country fed its enemies like this. No captors showed such abundance to prisoners who had fought against them. Yet the food was real, warm and solid on the plate before her. Around the mess hall, the other German women sat frozen, none of them willing to be the first to eat. It was Therese who finally picked up her fork. As a nurse, she had seen too much suffering, too much death, to refuse nourishment when it was offered, regardless of the source. She took a small bite of the mashed potatoes, and her eyes immediately widened. The other women watched her face for signs of poison or trickery, but all they saw was surprise and something that looked dangerously close to relief. One by one, the others began to eat. Ursula cut into her meatloaf and brought a piece to her mouth. The flavor exploded across her tongue, salt and pepper and something sweet she couldn't identify. It tasted like the Sunday dinners her mother used to make before the war, before everything became about rations and sacrifice and making do with less. She felt tears prick at her eyes and quickly blinked them away. She could not afford to feel gratitude toward her enemies, could not allow herself to be manipulated by full stomachs and warm food. 3 weeks into their captivity, the German women had settled into an uneasy routine. They worked in the camp laundry, mended uniforms, and helped with administrative tasks. The Americans continued to feed them regular meals, continued to treat them with a politeness that felt increasingly difficult to reconcile with everything they had been taught. But they maintained their distance, speaking only when necessary, keeping their conversations in German to preserve some sense of solidarity and separation from their captors. Then came the afternoon of October 7th, and everything changed because of dessert. Private Raymond Cooper had been given kitchen duty that week, and he had convinced Cook Williams to let him try his grandmother's recipe. The smell began drifting across the compound around 3 in the afternoon, sweet and buttery, with hints of cinnamon that made even the American guards stop and inhale deeply. By the time the dinner bell rang, every person in camp was wondering what Private Cooper had been cooking. Ursula entered the mess hall that evening to find the usual meal waiting, but there was an electricity in the air, an anticipation that hadn't been there before. The American guards were grinning at each other, and Cook Williams stood by the kitchen door with his arms crossed and a satisfied smile on his face. Sergeant Murphy announced in his Boston accent that there would be something special for dessert tonight, courtesy of Private Cooper's Georgia upbringing. The women ate their dinner with growing curiosity, watching as Cooper and Williams prepared something in the kitchen. Then they emerged carrying large pans of what looked like golden cake topped with glistening fruit, steam still rising from the surface. The smell intensified, and Ursula heard Inge actually gasp beside her. Cooper began serving, placing generous portions into small bowls and handing them out with a pride that suggested this was more than just food to him. This was something personal, something meaningful. When Ursula received her bowl, she stared down at the dessert. Peaches, she realized. Real peaches baked under some kind of sweet crust, the juice bubbling around the edges, turning thick and syrupy. She had not tasted peaches since before the war, since the summer of 1939 when her family had visited her grandmother's farm outside Dresden. She took a tentative bite, and the taste transported her instantly. The sweetness, the slight tartness of the fruit, the buttery richness of the topping. It was like being handed a piece of her childhood on a spoon. Around the mess hall, the reaction was immediate and unanimous. The German women, who had maintained such careful control over their emotions for weeks, could not hide their response to the peach cobbler. Smiles broke across faces that had been stern and guarded. Small sounds of pleasure escaped lips that had been pressed into thin lines of resistance. Therese closed her eyes as she ate, savoring each bite as if it were precious. Then, Hildegard did something unprecedented. She stood up, walked to the serving line, and in halting English asked the question that would change everything. "Please, may I have more?" Private Cooper's face lit up like a child on Christmas morning when Hildegard asked for seconds. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his southern drawl warm with genuine pleasure. "I made plenty. Anyone who wants more is welcome to it." He served Hildegard another generous portion, and the floodgates opened. Within minutes, half the German women were lined up for second helpings of peach cobbler, their carefully maintained distance crumbling in the face of something as simple as a well-made dessert. Ursula found herself in that line, though part of her screamed that this was wrong, that accepting kindness from the enemy was a form of betrayal. But the peach cobbler had awakened something in her she thought the war had killed, a memory of normalcy, of life before everything became about ideology and sacrifice and hatred. As Cooper served her second portion, he smiled and said something she only partially understood, something about his grandmother and Georgia peaches. She nodded, managing a small dainty that made him smile even wider. That evening marked a shift in the compound's atmosphere. The next morning at breakfast, Therese approached Sergeant Murphy with a carefully rehearsed question in English. "The peach dessert, what is called?" Murphy seemed delighted by the question. "Peach cobbler," he said slowly, pronouncing each syllable clearly. "It's a southern specialty. Private Cooper's people have been making it for generations." Therese nodded thoughtfully, then asked if there was a way to learn the recipe. The request seemed to surprise Murphy, but he promised to ask Cooper. By that afternoon, something remarkable had begun. Private Cooper, with Captain Garrett's permission, had organized an informal gathering in the mess hall. He stood at one of the long tables with ingredients laid out before him, and a dozen German women gathered around to watch as he demonstrated how to make peach cobbler. His explanations were in English, simple and clear, and the women who understood translated for those who did not. He showed them how to slice the peaches, how to mix the butter and sugar and flour into the perfect crumbly topping, how to judge when the fruit had released enough juice. But more than just technique was being shared. As Cooper worked, he talked about his grandmother, about growing up on a farm in Georgia, about Sunday dinners and family gatherings. And slowly, tentatively, the German women began to share their own food memories. Inge spoke in broken English about her mother's apple strudel, her voice soft with longing. Hildegard described the Christmas cookies her family made each December, recipes passed down for generations. The conversation expanded beyond desserts. The women talked about the foods they missed most from home, and the Americans reciprocated with their own nostalgic memories. Corporal James Watanabe, a Japanese-American guard who usually kept to himself, surprised everyone by describing his mother's mochi, explaining how rice could be transformed into something sweet and sticky and wonderful. The irony was not lost on anyone that Watanabe, whose own family had likely faced suspicion and prejudice because of the war, was sharing his cultural heritage with enemy prisoners. November brought cold rain to Kentucky and news that would shatter whatever fragile peace the German women had found in their captivity. The Americans had begun liberating concentration camps in Eastern Europe, and the first photographs were reaching Western newspapers. Captain Garrett, after much deliberation, decided the prisoners had a right to see what their country had done. She made newspapers and magazines available in the common room, knowing the impact would be devastating but believing the truth was necessary. Ursula was the first to find the magazines. She had been improving her English by reading American publications, enjoying the normalcy of articles about fashion and movies and everyday life. But this issue of Life magazine was different. The cover showed no cheerful images. Instead, it displayed a warning about disturbing content inside. Her hands trembled as she opened to the pages that would change everything she thought she knew about herself and her homeland. The photographs from Bergen-Belsen were grainy and stark. Skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood, living people who looked more like walking corpses than human beings. Guard towers and barbed wire and the unmistakable evidence of systematic murder on a scale she could not comprehend. The accompanying text described gas chambers, crematoriums, the deliberate starvation and extermination of millions. Jews, Romani people, political prisoners, anyone the Reich had deemed unworthy of life. Ursula's peach cobbler from lunch rose in her throat. She ran to the latrine and vomited until nothing remained but bile and horror. When she emerged, pale and shaking, she found Therese standing in the common room, holding the same magazine, tears streaming down her face. Around them, other women were discovering the photographs, their reactions ranging from denial to anguish to stunned silence. Ing sat on the floor, her back against the wall, staring at nothing. "We knew," she whispered in German. "How could we not have known?" But the terrible truth was that they had not known, not really. They had heard whispers about camps, about relocations, about the removal of Jews from German society. But they had believed the propaganda about work camps and resettlement. They had been told these people were being given new lives in the East. They had never imagined this. This systematic horror, this industrial-scale murder. Hildegard, always the most defiant among them, tried to argue that the photographs might be Allied propaganda, fake images designed to make Germans look monstrous. But her voice lacked conviction, and the evidence was too overwhelming, too detailed, too consistent across multiple sources. The Americans were discovering camp after camp, all of them revealing the same nightmare. That night, the mess hall felt different. The German women sat at their tables, picking at food they could barely taste, while images of starving prisoners haunted their minds. They had been eating 3 full meals a day, plus desserts like peach cobbler, while their own countrymen had been starving innocent people to death. The contrast was obscene, unbearable. Private Cooper brought out apple pie for dessert, another recipe from his grandmother, but most of the women could not bring themselves to eat it. The days following the revelation about the concentration camps were the darkest since the women's arrival at Camp Breckenridge. Many stopped eating altogether, their guilt transforming every meal into an accusation. Ursula forced herself to swallow food mechanically, but it tasted like ash in her mouth. How could she enjoy American generosity when her country had committed such atrocities? How could she accept kindness from people her nation had taught her to hate, when her own government had shown such monstrous cruelty to the innocent? Captain Garrett watched her prisoners spiral into despair and made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of leaving them to their guilt, she arranged for a meeting in the mess hall. All 32 German women sat on one side of the room, while the American staff gathered on the other. The tension was suffocating. Garrett stood between the two groups and spoke with a directness that cut through the heavy silence. "What your country did was evil," she said. And Ursula flinched at the word. "There's no other way to describe it. Evil, monstrous, unforgivable." She paused, letting the words settle. "But you are not your country. You are individuals who made choices based on lies you were told. The question now is what you do with the truth you've been given." Therese stood up, her voice breaking as she spoke in careful English. "How can you still feed us? How can you treat us with kindness when our country did such things?" It was the question all of them had been thinking. Sergeant Murphy was the one who answered. "Because you're not the ones who built those camps," he said. "You're young women who got caught up in something bigger than yourselves. And maybe the best way to fight evil is to show there's another way to treat people, even enemies." Private Cooper stepped forward, his usual cheerful demeanor subdued but earnest. "My grandmother always said, 'You can't fight hate with more hate,'" he said. "You fight it by showing folks what decency looks like. By breaking bread together even when it's hard." He gestured toward the kitchen. "I've got stew cooking back there. Navy bean stew with ham hocks, my mama's recipe. Now I know y'all might not feel like eating, but sometimes the most important meals are the ones we share when we're hurting." The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Sharing a meal, Breaking bread together was one of humanity's oldest rituals of peace and community. Cooper was offering more than food. He was offering a path forward, a way to acknowledge the horror while not being consumed by it. Slowly, reluctantly, the women began to move toward the tables. Ursula sat down across from Corporal Watanabe, who had been silent throughout the meeting. He ladled stew into her bowl with steady hands, and when he met her eyes, she saw neither judgment nor pity, only a quiet understanding that surprised her. "My family is in a camp too," he said quietly, "not like those camps, but Manzanar, because we're Japanese. So I understand what it's like when your country sees you as the enemy." November 23, 1944, brought an American holiday the German women had never heard of. Thanksgiving, Captain Garrett explained, was a day when Americans gathered to express gratitude for their blessings, to share abundant food with family and friends, and to remember that even in difficult times, there were reasons to be thankful. The irony was almost painful. What did enemy prisoners have to be grateful for in the middle of a war that had revealed such horrors? Yet Private Cooper and Cook Williams had been preparing for days, and the smells emanating from the kitchen suggested something extraordinary was coming. The mess hall had been decorated with paper cutouts of autumn leaves and small pumpkins from a nearby farm. Long tables had been pushed together to create one continuous surface, and for the first time, the German women would be eating alongside their American captors rather than separately. Captain Garrett had made it clear that participation was voluntary, but she hoped the women would join them in this tradition of gratitude and community. Ursula stood at the entrance to the mess hall, uncertain whether she could bear to participate in celebration when her conscience was so heavy. But Therese took her hand and gently pulled her inside. "We cannot undo what was done," Therese whispered in German. "But we can choose how we live now, in this moment. Maybe that is all any of us can do." The tables were laden with food on a scale the women had never seen, even before the war. A massive roasted turkey sat at the center, golden and glistening, surrounded by dishes that Cooper enthusiastically named as the women took their seats. Cornbread dressing with sage and onions. Sweet potato casserole topped with something he called marshmallows. Green bean casserole with crispy onions on top. Cranberry sauce that gleamed like rubies. Mashed potatoes whipped with butter and cream. Fresh rolls still warm from the oven. Hildegard stared at the abundance with tears in her eyes. "There are people starving in Europe," she said quietly. "How can we sit here and feast?" Sergeant Murphy, seated beside her, nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "There are people starving everywhere because of this war, but starving ourselves won't feed them. What we can do is remember this moment when the war ends. Remember that there's enough in this world for everyone if we choose to share it instead of hoard it or destroy it." Captain Garrett stood to speak before the meal began. "In the American tradition," she said, "we go around the table and each person says something they're grateful for. I know this might feel difficult given everything that's happened, but I invite you to try." She paused, then added, "I'll start. I'm grateful for the courage it takes to face hard truths and to keep going anyway." The sentiment passed around the table. Sergeant Murphy expressed gratitude for his family back in Boston. Cook Williams gave thanks for the ability to feed people and bring them comfort. Private Cooper spoke about being grateful for his grandmother's recipes and the memories they carried. When the turn came to the German women, a long silence fell over the table. Finally, Therese spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am grateful that even in captivity I have been shown what human dignity looks like. I am grateful that my enemies taught me about kindness when my own country forgot." Her words opened something in the others. Ing expressed gratitude for still being alive when so many were not. Hildegard gave thanks for the truth, painful as it was, because lies had caused so much suffering. When it came to Ursula, she found herself speaking words she had not planned. "I am grateful for peach cobbler," she said, and several people laughed softly, understanding that she meant something deeper than dessert. "I am grateful that food can remind us we are human, that sharing a meal can bridge the distance between enemies. The Thanksgiving feast continued with a warmth that transcended the awkwardness of the situation. Private Cooper taught the women how to make a proper turkey sandwich with cranberry sauce, insisting it was the best part of Thanksgiving. Corporal Watanabe shared stories about harvest festivals in Japanese tradition, finding common threads between cultures. As pumpkin pie was served for dessert, thick slices topped with fresh whipped cream, Ursula realized something profound. She was not just physically full. For the first time since the revelations about the concentration camps, the gnawing emptiness inside her had quieted slightly. December brought news that changed everything. Germany was losing the war rapidly now, and the American military was making plans for eventual repatriation of prisoners. The women would be sent home once hostilities ceased, returned to a homeland that existed now only in ruins and shame. The announcement should have brought relief, or at least certainty, but instead it triggered a crisis among the German prisoners. Late one evening, Ursula found herself in the kitchen, helping Private Cooper prepare bread for the next day. It had become a regular occurrence, these informal cooking sessions where the barriers between prisoner and guard dissolved into simple human connection. As she kneaded dough under Cooper's patient instruction, she finally voiced the question that had been haunting her. "What if we do not want to go back?" The words hung in the warm air between them. Cooper stopped his own kneading and looked at her carefully. "You serious about that?" Ursula nodded, tears streaming down her face into the dough beneath her hands. What is there to go back to? A country that committed evil, cities that are destroyed, families that may not have survived? Here, in this prison camp, I have found more humanity than I ever knew in freedom. Here I have learned what it means to be treated with dignity. How can I return to a place that taught me to hate? Cooper was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle but serious. "That's a big decision, Miss Becker. Staying here means giving up everything you knew, everyone you were. It means becoming something new entirely. Maybe that is what I need," Ursula replied, shaping the dough into a smooth ball. "To become something new. Someone who builds instead of destroys, who feeds instead of starves, who chooses kindness over hatred." She paused, looking up at Cooper with desperate hope. Is such a thing even possible? Can enemy prisoners simply choose to stay? Cooper admitted he did not know, but promised to speak with Captain Garrett. Within days, the question had spread through the camp. Ursula was not alone in her desire to remain in America rather than return to Germany. Therese confessed she had been thinking the same thing. Inge and Hildegard admitted their terror at the thought of going back to a country they no longer recognized or trusted. Of the 32 women, 14 began seriously discussing the possibility of requesting to stay. Captain Garrett listened to their petition with a mixture of sympathy and concern. The legal complications were enormous. They were prisoners of war, not immigrants. The Geneva Convention required their repatriation. There were no provisions for enemy combatants to simply choose to remain in the country that had captured them, but Garrett also understood that these women had undergone a genuine transformation. She had watched it happen day by day, meal by meal, conversation by conversation. They were not the same defiant, indoctrinated young women who had arrived in September. She sent urgent communications to her superiors explaining the unusual situation. While they waited for a response, life in the camp took on a strange intensity. The women who wanted to stay threw themselves into their work with new purpose, as if proving their worth might influence the decision. They helped Cook Williams develop new recipes, combining German and American traditions. They taught English to the other prisoners who had decided to return home. They volunteered for every task, trying to demonstrate that they could contribute to American society if given the chance. Private Cooper became their strongest advocate. He wrote letters to his congressmen, to military officials, even to newspapers, arguing that these women represented the best possibility for reconciliation after the war. If America could transform enemies into friends through simple decency and shared meals, what did that say about the power of their values? Sergeant Murphy and Corporal Watanabe added their voices, testifying to the genuine change they had witnessed. But the women also faced harsh criticism. News of their request leaked to the local community, and reaction was fierce. How dare Nazi prisoners ask to stay in America when American boys were still dying in Europe? What kind of precedent would this set? Some demanded the women be sent back immediately, arguing that any kindness shown to them was a betrayal of Allied soldiers. Mrs. Dorothy Green, a local church volunteer who had begun visiting the camp, organized a counter-petition. She gathered signatures from community members who had met the women, who had seen their genuine remorse and their earnest desire to make amends through service and contribution. 25 years later, on a crisp autumn afternoon in 1969, Ursula Becker Cooper stood in her kitchen in Louisville, Kentucky, preparing peach cobbler for her family's Thanksgiving dinner. Her hands moved with the practiced ease of someone who had made this dessert hundreds of times, but today felt different. Today, her grandchildren would taste the recipe that had changed her entire life. The wooden box from Dresden sat on a shelf nearby, still containing the photograph, prayer book, and fountain pen she had clutched on that September day in 1944. But surrounding it now were other treasures: her American citizenship papers, photographs of her wedding to Raymond Cooper, pictures of their 3 children, and letters from the other women who had made the same impossible choice she had. The decision had finally come through in March of 1945. 14 German women prisoners would be allowed to remain in the United States under a special humanitarian provision, reclassified as displaced persons rather than enemy combatants. They would need sponsors, employment, and community support, but they would be given the chance to build new lives on American soil. The transition had not been easy. Ursula had faced suspicion and hostility from some quarters. There were people who would never forgive her nationality, never trust her transformation. But the Cooper family had stood by her, and Raymond's patient courtship had shown her that the kindness she experienced in the camp could extend into civilian life. Therese had become a nurse at a veterans hospital, spending her life caring for the very soldiers who had fought against her country. Inge married an American engineer and raised 4 children who knew both German lullabies and American folk songs. Hildegard became a teacher, dedicated to ensuring that future generations understood the dangers of hatred and propaganda. The women who had chosen to return to Germany had carried different lessons home. They wrote letters describing the devastation they found, but also the hope of rebuilding. They spoke of how their experience in American captivity had taught them that former enemies could become partners in creating something better than what had been destroyed. As Ursula placed the peach cobbler in the oven, her granddaughter Emma wandered into the kitchen, drawn by the familiar smell. "Grandma, why do you always make peach cobbler for Thanksgiving? Wouldn't pumpkin pie be more traditional?" Ursula smiled, pulling the child close. "Because peach cobbler reminds me that the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. It reminds me that sharing food is how we tell people they matter, that they belong, that they are worthy of nourishment and care." She thought about that moment in the mess hall, when she had asked for seconds, how that simple request had been the first step toward admitting that her enemies were human, that their kindness was real, that everything she had believed about them was wrong. Going back for seconds had required more courage than she knew she possessed. It meant acknowledging hunger, vulnerability, and the possibility that she had been lied to about everything that mattered.